What's it say?
Amun-Ra, Amun-Day. It speaks of the night and of the day. Sueyaharum hoktub sin mas ibet baya. Imatipin sumpike sitsue yatue yatue yatue.
Hello everyone, welcome to a new CAMNES studio video. In this video we are going to see a series of clichés related to ancient Egypt that are particularly loved by movies. Are you curious? Let's go! Of course, movies are not documentaries, so as well as TV series and novels, comics, it's normal that they do not have to be completely and totally adherent to historical facts. They usually have a plot, an invented and made-up plot, and all the elements that are related to this plot are invented as well. And that's perfectly normal. So in this video, I'm not going to criticize the fact that movies are fictionalized. I just want to list a series of clichés and show you the historical counterpart of those clichés. But before moving forward, I would like to start from how and when cinema, the film industry, started to be influenced by ancient Egypt. As you probably know, if you had the chance to watch other videos of this channel, at the very end of the 18th century, Napoleon organized a military expedition, a military campaign in Egypt, and he decided to bring along not only soldiers, of course, but also savants, so let's say scholars, people who have to document everything that they were seeing in this foreign country, in Egypt. So they decided to publish all their observation in La Description de l'Égypte, and thanks to this publication, the so-called Western world got in contact with the ancient Egyptian culture, because in this publication there were images of local fashion, of animals, of vegetation, and of course also Egyptian antiquities. So basically during the 19th century, all the arts started to be profoundly influenced by ancient Egypt, and ancient Egyptian style in particular, fashion, jewelry, architecture, and so on. So no surprise when the film industry, when cinema was influenced as well by the ancient Egyptian culture. Conventionally, the birth of cinema dates back to 1895, and a few years later, in 1917, an entire movie dedicated to Cleopatra was released, and therefore, starting from its birth, the cinema was somehow affected by the ancient Egyptian culture. And usually movies, when referred to ancient Egypt, use this sort of mysterious tone. The ancient Egyptian culture is seen as an enigmatic culture surrounded by this dark atmosphere. And that's quite weird, because actually ancient Egyptian culture was extremely bright, extremely colorful, and it is hard for us scholars to connect, to link the ancient Egyptian culture to darkness. However, there are many clichés, not only this atmosphere that is common to many movies related to ancient Egypt, set or linked to ancient Egypt. There are many clichés where we can see some characteristic of the ancient Egyptian culture that are not actually true. So in this video, as I said, we are going to list a series of clichés, and we are going to see also the historical counterpart, the truth related to those clichés. So, number one, physical appearance. Usually, not always, but most of the times, actors and actresses who play ancient Egyptians are Caucasian. Actually, ancient Egyptians, as well as contemporary ones, are not Caucasian, and therefore that is a forgery, that is a fake vision of the ancient Egyptian culture. This fact actually should be inserted in a wider discussion on colonialism and on how the so-called Western world sees ancient Egypt. But in this video, I will just list this series of clichés without going into details of such a complex and intricate topic, which luckily has been much discussed in the past few years. So, number one, physical appearance. Number two, the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead is usually shown as a proper volume, a proper book with pages and cover and everything. But actually, the true Book of the Dead was a bit different. First of all, there wasn't only one Book of the Dead in ancient Egypt. There were many versions of the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead is basically a sort of collection of spells, of vignettes, of formulae to help the deceased reach the afterlife safe and sound. And basically all those who were rich enough to have a funerary equipment had also their own version of the Book of the Dead. But obviously, those formulae were not written or designed on a proper volume, but on papyrus, and in particular on a papyrus scroll. Therefore, the Book of the Dead was not a volume as we know it, a book as we know it, but a papyrus scroll. Number three, Cleopatra. Cleopatra in movies is usually seen as this beautiful queen, this sexy and sensual woman, but nothing more than this. Whereas the actual Cleopatra was way more interesting than this figure that usually is represented in movies. Cleopatra, let's start from the very beginning. She probably wasn't so similar to our aesthetic canons. According to a series of portraits, of Roman portraits that we have of Cleopatra, and I'm thinking about, for instance, portraits on Roman coins, Cleopatra had some very peculiar physical characteristics, and therefore probably she wasn't so similar to our contemporary, to our modern aesthetic canons. But nonetheless, she was fascinating. And this charm that she had was strictly related to the fact that she was extremely brilliant, extremely wise. She knew several languages. Therefore, she was fascinating, but for her brain rather than for her physical appearance. I'm not going into details on this character because we are going to publish another video entirely dedicated on Cleopatra in this channel. Number four, someone who is mummified alive. That is, of course, a cliché that is strictly related to specific genre, for instance, horror movies or adventure movies. And here, the main problem is the word mummified. I mean, it's not someone who has been buried alive. It is possible that in ancient Egypt, someone was buried alive. Yes, as well as today, someone might be buried alive. The main problem here is the word mummification, because I don't know if you are familiar with the mummification process. It was composed of many different steps, many different rites. And from the very beginning, the very first of this step involves the removal of the internal organs of the person, of the deceased, including brain, and therefore it is quite difficult, it is quite hard to believe that someone was able to stay alive after this very first phase of the mummification process. So it's quite hard to believe that someone was actually mummified alive. Number 5, cats. This is a cliché which is related to movies, but also to general knowledge. Usually, we say that cats were extremely happy and extremely lucky to live during ancient Egyptian times, but this is not entirely true. I mean, some cats were happy and lucky. For instance, pets. Some cats, in fact, live in houses, and when they died, they were mummified and their body was placed into coffins. And then when the owner died, those coffins were placed within the tomb of the owner, and then the owner and the cat would have stayed together for the eternity. So those cats were lucky and potentially happy, as well as those who were believed the earthly incarnation of some deities, such as Bastet. Bastet was a goddess, an Egyptian goddess, who was usually represented as a woman with a feline head, or as a cat, entirely as a cat. And therefore, some cats were considered the incarnation of that goddess and were worshipped as deities. So those cats as well were lucky, definitely. But there were other cats who were intentionally killed to be mummified and then offered to Bastet, to deities in general. Therefore, some cats were not so lucky to be alive in ancient Egyptian times, because these cats were intentionally killed. They were sacrificed for Bastet, to be offered to Bastet or other Egyptian deities. Number 6, who built the pyramids? Again, this is something partially related to movies, but also to general knowledge. Aliens didn't, of course, but jokes aside, neither did slaves. Slaves didn't build the pyramids. So, who did it? Workers. Proper workers. People who were paid for their job, paid to build those gigantic and wonderful buildings, such as the pyramids in the Giza Plateau. So, let ancient Egyptian workers get credit for their amazing job. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Of course, if you have in mind other clichés, please write them down in the comments here under the video. Whereas if you have questions concerning archaeology, please write your question to ask@camnes.org. Thank you so much.
Hi guys, if you want to discover more about archaeology and our ancient past from a different perspective, make sure to click on the CAMNES logo here below. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you will never miss an episode and join the archaeological community in search of the truth.